Open your Bibles with me to Daniel chapter 3. That's where we'll be tonight, Lord willing. And we'll actually start at the last couple of verses of chapter 2. And if the commentators and learned men like those that participated in the Reese Chronological Bible are correct, chapter 3 starts roughly 18 years after the end of chapter 2. That would make it that Daniel has been promoted, what we'll read at the end of chapter 2, and has been in that elevated position for about 18 years. He had that 3 year of quote, training, more like reprogramming, and he and his 3 friends, the king had found their wisdom to be 10 times greater than any of his wise men. And then, of course, after Daniel was able to tell Nebuchadnezzar what he was thinking as he laid upon his pillow that night, he was able to tell him what the dream was, and he was able to tell him what the dream meant. He was able to describe, this pagan king was given the image, and Daniel was able to interpret it all, and tell him what it was, interpret it all, and show us the times of the Gentiles and the 4 successive kingdoms, starting with Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon, and then the Medo-Persians take over, and then the Greek kingdom with Alexander the Great, and then the Roman kingdom after that, and then that simply as an entity just in a lot of ways dissolves into the time of the Gentiles. And that's exactly what he said would happen as the Roman kingdom intermarried. So let's pick this up in Daniel chapter 2, verses 48 and 49. Then the king made Daniel a great man and gave him many great gifts and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief of the governors over all the wise men of Babylon. And Daniel requested of the king to set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, their Babylonian names, over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel sat in the gate of the king. Daniel was elevated. Maybe we would have called him prime minister, but he was elevated in the kingdom. And this was a response of Nebuchadnezzar seeing that Daniel understood things that nobody else could understand, and he gives this the credit in verse 47. The king answered unto Daniel and said, "Of a truth it is that your God is a God of gods, and a Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets, seeing thou couldst reveal this secret." So Nebuchadnezzar seemingly had this great revelation of who God was. We're going to see that tonight that that's not the case. That revelation is coming, but it's not in chapter 2. So the dream, the interpretation given, the time of the outline, the time of the Gentiles outlined, all of that's in place. And chapter 3 then starts, according to, like I say, the Reese Chronological Bible, 18 years later. So Daniel's been in the Babylonian realm for 21 years, if that is correct. Nebuchadnezzar, the king, made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits, and the breadth thereof 6 cubits. He set it up in the plain of Dura, in the province of Babylon. So this is a rather, on the one hand, it's a rather common thing. He sets up this image. Now, he's going to do something that is rather uncommon. He's going to do something with it that's a little perplexing to some. Not to, I don't find it perplexing at all. But this, we want to look at the height of it, 60 cubits. That would equal roughly 90 feet. And the width of it, 6 cubits, that would equal roughly 9 feet. So that dimension, that proportion, causes many to think that it was maybe setting on a pedestal. That the whole image wasn't like this, because it's we're going to see this image, it would be too tall for its width. And so many believe that it was set up on a pedestal. Many also believe that the image wasn't of solid gold, but of a gold plating, which was very common. There's references in the scriptures to that. None of that, neither here nor there. Why did he do it? Why did he have this image constructed? Why did he do this? Well, there's some practical ways or reasons that one might arrive at the answer to why. He may still be, and I think this is hard to get around as a possibility, it's hard to ignore. He may still be hearing the words of Daniel. Thou art the head of gold. You, Nebuchadnezzar. And now, Nebuchadnezzar reigned as a sole monarch. I believe it was for 40 years, and if this is 18 years into it, he's rather at the pinnacle of that rule. And it would be hard to think that that those words had no effect on him. Thou art that head of gold, Nebuchadnezzar. And as they become the dominating power, as he assumes the throne as a sole monarch after his father died, and these things may have rattled around in his mind. Thou art this head of gold. And so it could be that he just, full of himself, full of pride, wants to build a lasting legacy of himself. Others also interject that it is not uncommon at all to rally the empire around a common cause. Unite the empire around a common religion. For we're going to see in this text, verses 4 through 7 especially, this image was to be worshipped. This image was to be bowed before and worshipped. And any point of commonality, any point of a rallying cry that can unite the nation. Maybe he looked and felt as though there was a need for a uniting of the nation. Maybe he looked and there was a need for unifying their religious activity. That across the nation he sees a diversity that brings division. And you understand that even in our own nation, in any nation, when there's diversity of religion, there's a lot of different viewpoints. And even under the banner of Christian, there are so many different viewpoints. And if he can mitigate that, if he can minimize that, and have a common rally point, and have a common religion, and it doesn't hurt that he'll cut you into little pieces and turn your house into a dunghill. It doesn't hurt, or in this case, that he has the power to do what I just said, or in this case, cook you in a furnace. It doesn't hurt that the command comes with authority to take your life. And so there's a lot of motivation to do what he says. There's a lot of motivation to listen to the king and unite around this image. No doubt would have had some reflection of him in it. So Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits, the breadth thereof 6 cubits, or 90 feet high, 9 feet wide. He set it up in the plain of Dura. Nice wide open space in the province of Babylon. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king said to gather together the princes, the governors, the captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image which Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. So there's a list of attendees. And it wasn't a request. You were to attend. Then it's humorous that verse 3 articulates the very same list. Some commentators even muse at why is verse 3 necessary. It points out the fact that everybody did, and I can't say everybody without exception, but in the main, what we would call, generally speaking, everybody did. And there had to be accountability because we will find Daniel's three friends are called to the carpet for not obeying. So there were accountability levels. There were requirements and expectations to be there. And verse 3 reiterates every category: the princes, the governors, the captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the provinces were gathered together to the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So they came. They were summoned to come, and they came. You have to wonder, was it in strict loyalty to Nebuchadnezzar? I mean, Nebuchadnezzar, and listen, history records that he was a tremendously gifted leader and ruler. History records him to be a brilliant man and a gifted architect and so many things that he could put in his column. And so are the people thinking, hey, we're blessed just to be a part of this amazing kingdom, and Neb wants us to come bow before the image? Well, we'll be glad to do that. Are they coming out of fear? Because we're going to read, if you don't bow before the image, you're going to burn. And so even the summons to come, it goes without saying, you better come. So they come. Whether it be out of loyalty, whether it be because everybody else is doing it, I don't want to be the odd guy out, or whether it be because I don't really want to cross the king. He's made some strong edicts in the past about those that let him down. I don't want to do that. And so verse 3 records that they come. Verse 4, then an herald cried aloud. So they're out in the plain of Dura. The image is there, glistening, sunlight beaming off of it, the high polished gold, and people are there, and the edict goes out. A herald cried aloud, to you it is commanded. Now he's got quite the audience. People show up because they feel they must. People show up because the king's word is backed by authority. People show up because the king can take your life. And now they're there. Captive audience. And now that you're here, it is commanded, O people, nations, and languages. Notice how universal this was intended by Nebuchadnezzar. This wasn't intended to be a little province off in the corner of the kingdom, and everybody else does their thing. O people, nations, and languages, at what time you hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, dulcimer, and all kinds of music, Ye fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king," throw that in there, "that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up. And whoso falleth not down and worshipeth shall the same hour be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace." How'd you like to live in a regime like that? He gets them all out there and they come. They come out of duty, obligation, loyalty, whatever the reasons they're there. They may have in their mind many different mindsets as it relates to the image. Why, that's an obvious ego trip on Nebuchadnezzar's part. Or if those that are very loyal to him, they may be very supportive of the idea and the concept and think, that's a good rallying point. That's a good unifying point for the country. Who knows how many of them went there intending to bow? Who knows how many of them went there intending to worship the image? But now they were in a position where they had to, or die. And so, and then I can't get around the fact that verse 5, music is employed. Music can really move the emotions. It's no accident that this music has been employed at this juncture. We're getting more and more away from it because of our nation's decline. But around the July 4th time, in the very patriotic music that's often played, it really warms my heart to be thankful to God that He has allowed us to live in this great land. And as messed up as she is, I'd still rather live here than anywhere else that I know of. And music sets the heart soft for that patriotic thought. I had a man in the church, the deacon in the church down in Florida that played in a municipal band. And they always played a lot of patriotic music in the band. And we went to it several times, and I always very much enjoyed it. It really softens the heart towards the patriotic thinking. And that's why some sectors of our society don't like the patriotic music, because they don't want the heart softened towards a positive thought process towards this country, that they want us to be painted as wrong. And that's as far as I'll go politically. The music was employed here, and that would be to in part set the stage, move the emotions. And so there's a lot of leverage placed upon those that are there. They've gathered from far and wide under the king's command, and they come to the dedication of the image. Come to the dedication of the image. Well, why not? Now that you're here, bow before the image in worship. And so you have the music to move them, and if that doesn't matter, and if that's not enough, you have the king's authority to move them. Bow, or I will put you in a furnace. Verse 6, whoso falleth not down and worshipeth shall the same hour be cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Therefore, at that time, when all the people heard the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and all kinds of music, all the people, the nations, the languages, notice it's not a little corner of some small province in the kingdom. This is intended to be universal. They fell down and worshipped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. We won't get into this tonight. We want to chase a different thought. But verse 8 tells us At that time, the Chaldeans came near and accused the Jews. There were some guys that didn't bow in worship. And we'll get into this in the next message, Lord willing, that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, again, their Chaldean names, were called on the carpet for not bowing. And we know how that story turned out. We'll deal with it next week. But at this point, I want to delve into how could a man, Nebuchadnezzar, after saying what he said in verse 47, that Daniel, your God is a God of gods, a Lord of kings, a revealer of secrets. Your God, Daniel, did something none of my gods could do, none of my wise men could figure out. Your God. How does a man with that kind of at least surface mental assent to the power, omniscience of God, and omniscience of God, how does he do what he just did? How does he make an image and require not just a few, but expect a universal obedience to the demand to fall before this golden image and worship? It's not patriotic. It's not purely patriotic. There may have been patriotic elements to what he was trying to do. But it wasn't purely patriotic. This image was to be worshipped. And if, in his mind, God, the God of Daniel, was a God of gods, how did he do this? How did he command it? How is it that this man did not say, Daniel, your God is a God of gods, and I want everybody in the kingdom to bow? He makes a pretense to it, but that's not where he is. And I know 18 years, if the commentators are right, and if the Reese Chronological Bible is right, 18 years have transpired. And he's probably still hearing what Daniel said, thou art the head of gold. How could he do this? This is no big surprise. This does not perplex me in the least. The man is lost at this point. The man is dead in trespasses and sins, full of himself, full of the flesh, and he's lost. And he can't see God. Well, he's seen miracles. There's a large movement. And it's not new. But there's a large segment of the religious population that claim miracles are still in play. And obviously God does miracles, I believe, every day. I'm not saying he stopped doing miracles. I'm saying he stopped using men to do miracles. He still is doing miracles. But there's a large sector that flies under the banner of Christian that says, unless you can do miracles, there's no proof God is with you. Unless you can do miracles, there's no proof God is with you. And they claim that the miracles are what God uses to demonstrate himself. Now, they're partly right. That was true. That was true in the time of Moses. That was true in the time of the apostles. There were time periods when God worked in that manner. But the Bible now tells us that those things ceased when the completed revelation was given. And turn with me to John chapter 6 for how the Lord addresses this idea of miracles and their effectiveness on the human mind. Their effectiveness on a lost mind, a lost individual with a normal fleshly mind that has never been touched by the true power of God. Chapter 6, John, chapter 6. And I want you to notice verse 26 and 29. The Lord says, Jesus answered them and said, Verily, verily, I say unto you, ye seek me not because you saw the miracles, but because you did eat of the loaves and were filled. Even they're seeking. He says you seek me. There's no question about that. They're following after him. They're seeking him. But not because that he performed miracles and they wanted to see God. Not because that he performed miracles and they were convinced he was God. They seek him because you did eat of the loaves and were filled. Even that, where they followed after him because they saw this miracle, they followed after him to satisfy their flesh. Verse 29, they asked the question, what shall we do? In verse 28, that we might work the works of God. Jesus answers and said unto them, this is the work of God, that you believe on him whom he hath sent. You believe on him. Verse 26, they just followed him for what they could get. Nebuchadnezzar saw a miracle. Nebuchadnezzar alluded to the fact that Daniel was enabled by God miraculously to tell him what he thought that night as he gets ready to go to sleep, and to tell him what the dream was as he's sleeping, and then unfold the interpretation of that. And Nebuchadnezzar is enamored with it all, and enamored with Daniel's God. But his heart had not been changed. He's still a lost man. So how that he could set that image up, that doesn't surprise me a bit. How that he could demand that people were. I thought he was a true God, Daniel's God. Doesn't surprise me a bit that he's walked away from that. Doesn't surprise me a bit that he sets up his own God and says, you worship him or die. Even if he saw a miracle, that doesn't change. Seeing a miracle doesn't change the heart. And then you have the idea of the Lord asking Peter, and I reference this all the time. I'm sorry I do, but I'm not. The Lord asked Peter in Matthew 16, who do men say that I am? Peter responds with an answer, who the men say that he is. And Peter, who do you say that I am? Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. And the Lord's response to Peter needs to resonate in our thinking, because it will transform your thinking as to our duty in spreading the gospel. Flesh and blood hath not revealed this unto you, but my Father which is in heaven. Salvation, which is accompanied with a true understanding of who God is, does not come by information. I cannot articulate enough facts to convince anybody that God is God. Now, that doesn't stop you from trying. That doesn't stop you from doing the best that you can to articulate facts. That doesn't stop you from employing good, reasonable apologetics to try to convey who God is. But you have to remember, and Nebuchadnezzar is proof of this, you have to remember it has to be God that gives it. It has to be God that gives the understanding. Nebuchadnezzar seemed to get it, and then builds an image and says, bow or die. Because his heart had not been changed. His understanding. Brother Kirkman always said, salvation does not come by information. You cannot, through information, force somebody to believe. Although you give them all the information you can possibly give them, as much as they'll let you give them, you try, but you realize salvation does not come by way of information. Salvation is from divine revelation. God has to work on the heart. We are the givers, the proclaimers. We are the ones maybe used of God to articulate who God is. We see Paul doing it. We see Peter doing it. We see the other men in the Bible preaching. And Paul, as methodically and as systematically as anybody, states in Acts 17 who God is. But he leaves it in the hands of God. He doesn't buttonhole people, pin them down in a corner and force them to say something or force them to repeat something. That is a misuse, I believe, of our call to evangelize. And Nebuchadnezzar gives us an illustration of the depravity of the mind. Nebuchadnezzar gives us an illustration of the man that the God of this world hath blinded the minds of them that believe not. 2 Corinthians 4:4. The God of this world hath blinded the minds of them that believe not. Nebuchadnezzar, at this point in his life, was just as pagan as he ever was, even having said, Daniel, your God's a God of gods. I've never seen anything like it. And then walk away from it because his heart wasn't changed. In 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 2, Paul describes believing in vain. I'm of the conviction that believing in vain, he said, you're saved by the gospel unless you've believed in vain. And I'm of the conviction that is a head knowledge of Christ, a head knowledge of the gospel, a head knowledge of some facts. And when one believes in vain, he can at some point walk away from it. It hasn't effectually changed his heart. It hasn't effectually changed his life. He's given mental assent to a few facts. Maybe a well-meaning but misguided preacher has pinned him down and said, say this. If you don't say this, you'll be lost. And so somebody says it because they're told to. And they're still lost most times. Just now they've been told they said the right thing and now they're good. And many have believed in vain, as Paul puts it in 1 Corinthians 15. Reminds me of Matthew 19 when the apostles are asking the Lord, who then can be saved? They had a prime candidate, and Jesus let him walk away. And the apostles said, who then can be saved if not this guy? And the Lord said, with men this is impossible. With God all things are possible. So all that I'm saying in this illustration with Nebuchadnezzar, it's no surprise to me that he did what he did. He was lost. He was a pagan king. I think in Daniel chapter 4, God gets a hold of him. But he hasn't yet. Not in Daniel chapter 2 and 3. And so he's pretty full of himself. God takes that away. He's pretty full of himself. And he does what a pagan king would naturally do. Do everything he can do to unite his kingdom, rally around himself, and make himself the center of the kingdom by scaring them to death or by moving them with patriotic thoughts, by moving religious enterprise is one of the most propelling things known to man. We are pre-wired to be religious. We instinctively know that there's more to life than me, us, this, now. And so we're driven to be religious to try to be ready for what comes after. And that's manifest in all sorts of ways. So Nebuchadnezzar can tap into that pre-wiring that's already inside of an individual and say, well, his God's good as any, right? Everybody else is doing it. And that poses some people some problem. That poses some people some issue as to how he could do that after what he said. Let's read John 3 and close. Doesn't pose me any problem. Now I say these things tonight not to discourage you from sharing the gospel, not to discourage you from taking the opportunities that the Lord gives to tell others of Christ and explain who Christ is and what He's done, and do like Paul and tell who God is and that He's the Creator, and read Acts 17 and see how Paul approaches the pagan society in front of him. He starts at creation. He's trying to explain who God is, and he's trying to explain who Jesus is, and talks to him about the resurrection and so on. And I'm not trying to discourage you from doing those things. I'm merely reminding each one of us that it has to be God that gives it. Get all the understanding you can get, but it has to ultimately come from God. Give all the information you can give, but a real understanding of that information ultimately has to come from God. And that comes when the beginning of that, the genesis of that, the beginning of that has to come, in my estimation, John 3, verse 3. Verily, verily, I say unto thee, except a man be born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God. He can't see the authority. He can't see the kingdom. He doesn't have a right view unless he's born again. Nebuchadnezzar thought he had a pretty good beat on who Daniel's God was. Even made some true statements about who Daniel's God is. But he was not in Daniel in chapter 2 or 3 born again. Arguments are after chapter 4 he was. But certainly not in chapter 2 and 3. Except a man be born again. And remember to look that up sometime and see in the Greek how it is to be born from above. That born again is born from above. It's not of an earthly origin. It's of a divine origin. Both in verse 3 and in verse 7 where it says born again, the word has to do with born from above. Divine origin. Nicodemus says, how can a man be born when he is old? Can he enter the second time into his mother's womb and be born? Jesus answered, verily, verily, I say unto thee, except a man be born of water, I believe that's the fleshly birth, and of the Spirit, the spiritual birth, he cannot enter the kingdom of God. That which is born of flesh is flesh. That which is born of spirit is spirit. Marvel not that I say unto thee, ye must be born from above. The wind bloweth where it listeth, and thou hearest the sound thereof, but canst not tell where it cometh and whither it goeth. So is everyone that is born of the Spirit of God. I do not say anything I said tonight to discourage anybody from sharing the gospel. But when you share the gospel, commit it to the Lord. When you share the gospel, prayerfully look to the Lord for granting understanding, for revealing to the individual a right understanding of who he is. Give them all the information they'll let you give them. But realize it has to be God that gives the understanding. And so it puts a new focus. This is the preacher's dilemma. This is the evangelist's dilemma. This is the gospel sharer's dilemma. I do everything I can do to get people to see something, and yet at the same time I recognize that it has to be God that allows them to see it. Doesn't stop me from trying to get people to see it. It just puts the responsibility on them. And it guards me from trying to press somebody into a decision or a statement. Because look at Nebuchadnezzar. He's a living example, was then, of the thought process of a depraved man. Even though he thought so much right about God at one point. Next week, Lord willing, we'll look at burning fiery furnace and 3 fellas that were put there because they wouldn't bow. Let's stand.